She came home 2 hours early because of a canceled meeting and an impulse she could not explain. The gates of her Beverly Hills estate sighed open beneath her SUV, the winter light thin and precise across the manicured hedges. Inside, the house hummed with the familiar echo of air systems and distant televisions, an immaculate silence that had become the soundtrack of Sabrina Lennox's life. She expected that silence. She had built a life around it. Schedules, board meetings, quarterly targets, a calendar full of other people's emergencies. Instead, she heard something she hadn't heard in months: real laughter. Not the polite, subdued chuckle that visited on birthdays and staged celebrations, but the clear, belly laugh of a 6-year-old discovering something new. It came from the wing of the house where Julian slept. She stopped at the threshold, barefoot on the cool marble, and let the sound fold over her. It landed harder than any report she had ever read. For a moment, she just stood there, a woman who had learned to measure everything in deliverables, undone by an ordinary human sound. The door to Julian's room was half open. Through the slit she saw movement. A man on his knees at the foot of the bed, his sleeves rolled, hands rough and precise as they guided Julian's little legs through a sequence of gentle lifts. Julian's face was flushed with concentration and delight. His hair was a messy halo on the pillow. The man's hands were calloused, but his touch was careful, as if he were handling glass. Around them, the room felt less like an exhibit and more like a place where someone was being made, steadily and patiently, into something braver than his diagnosis. Sabrina's first instinct was to be furious. Her next was to be ashamed of that anger. She stepped back until the door hid the scene and leaned against the hull, trading the heat of the house for the cold calculation she'd learned in boardrooms. Who was this man? Why was he inside her house, kneeling in her son's room? Her mind began to run through possibilities: unauthorized caregiver, overzealous volunteer, liability, until the laughter from inside cut through her inventory of fears and settled into something else: curiosity, sharp and stubborn. She had not intended to stay, but she stayed. She watched through the crack as the man, a janitor she knew by sight from the security desk, Elliot Hayes, worked. He used simple words with Julian, words soft enough to be toys. Lift, breathe, brave. He made a crooked little device from foam and duct tape that fit under Julian's knee like a custom promise. He spoke as if the boy were not fragile but capable, and Julian answered him with a trust that made the room light in a way Sabrina had not felt since Julian was a newborn. Sabrina's first instinct was to be furious. Her next was to be ashamed of that anger. She stepped back until the door hid the scene and leaned against the hull, trading the heat of the house for the cold calculation she'd learned in boardrooms. Who was this man? Why was he inside her house, kneeling in her son's room? Her mind began to run through possibilities: unauthorized caregiver, overzealous volunteer, liability, until the laughter from inside cut through her inventory of fears and settled into something else: curiosity, sharp and stubborn. She had not intended to stay, but she stayed. She watched through the crack as the man, a janitor she knew by sight from the security desk, Elliot Hayes, worked. He used simple words with Julian, words soft enough to be toys. Lift, breathe, brave. He made a crooked little device from foam and duct tape that fit under Julian's knee like a custom promise. He spoke as if the boy were not fragile but capable, and Julian answered him with a trust that made the room light in a way Sabrina had not felt since Julian was a newborn.
She would later replay the moment in a dozen different narratives, trying to decide which one explained her sudden break in logic: that a man who emptied trash bins had knowledge she lacked, that someone without diplomas in the right places could touch her son in a way she could not. But in the instant she watched, she felt the first real and uninvited stirrings of something that had been dormant in her for years: the memory of being held by someone who chose to be present. If this story is speaking to you, stay with it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. The laughter subsided into small victories: A new range of movement, a tentative reach for a toy, a high five that Julian celebrated like a triumph. Elliot spoke quietly to the boy, and when Julian crowed, he let himself smile, an honest, private thing that revealed lines around his eyes like a map of hard nights and softer mornings. Sabrina did not step into the room. She retreated down the hall, not because she wanted to avoid discovery, but because she needed distance to breathe. Her life had taught her to react too quickly. Decisions made in heat were seldom good decisions. Instead, she moved to the study and sat with the blinds closed, watching remote feeds of her house on her tablet. Security, nanny cams, the discreet system she deployed in a dozen residences she owned. From that safe, high perspective, she pressed play and watched the scene again, as if some replay could explain how she had let months pass without hearing that sound in her own home. In the weeks that followed, she watched more than she intervened. She told herself she was collecting data. Habit, however, grew into an unlabeled thing. She waited at odd hours to overhear the low murmur of therapy in Julian's room. She noticed the faint scent of coffee on the janitor's sleeves when he passed by the kitchen. She cataloged the soft, precise language he used with other children when they came through the center of staff and service that the Lennox Foundation ran sporadically in their philanthropic calendar. Sabrina had always believed in efficiency. Empathy, for her, had been an instrument rather than a practice, deployed where it achieved measurable outcomes. Julian's condition had become one more set of metrics on a chart. Appointments scheduled and missed, devices purchased and returned to boxes, consultations with specialists whose words floated past her like technical documents. She had done what the world told a mother in her position to do. She had bought the best equipment and created a rolling roster of therapists and home modifications. Looked at briefly, her efforts could have seemed enough, but watching Elliot with Julian exposed the quiet deficit in her plan: presence. Money could buy access to treatments, but it could not manufacture the patient, unglamorous, repetition-filled grace of someone who returned, again and again, with nothing more than a promise to be there.
Curiosity mutated into something more tactical. If she could not comprehend what the janitor was doing in a single viewing, she could at least find out. She instructed IT to add an additional camera in the hallway outside Julian's room, authorized for safety and documentation, she told them, so she could observe without stepping into the intimacy of the boy's space. Watching felt less intrusive when it was framed as a safeguard. Watching, she told herself, was a form of stewardship. What she observed over the next fortnight did not simplify. The man she had noticed in the hallway was not merely a janitor. He arrived early each morning and stayed late. He left the building midday and returned at dusk. He carried with him worn backpacks filled with foam wedges, hand-carved splints, and handwritten sheets of exercises. At St. Mary Community Center, where a faded sign announced "Open Nights, All Welcome," he ran a corner of the room like a clinic. Children lined up for puzzles and for the awkward, tender work of retraining muscles and building confidence. Parents watched and sometimes cried, unashamed. Elliot moved among them with a focused gentleness that felt almost holy in its ordinariness. There were moments when the camera caught him outside, holding the hand of a little girl who was not his charge in that house at all. Nora, 8, with wide observing eyes and a way of folding herself into the world that demanded patience, sat on a bench and ate a sandwich, while Elliot measured the length of a stride with a wooden ruler. He kissed the top of her head before he left. The way he looked at her unsettled Sabrina more than she expected. The camera also caught pages from a notebook Elliot kept tucked beneath his mattress in the staff bathroom at St. Mary. Lists of exercises, progress charts, and a careful looping signature. On a morning when curiosity had moved her from observation to action, Sabrina found herself slipping into the janitor's small rented garage behind the building in Burbank. The man's life was not inside J-June spreadsheets, it was taped together with duct tape and hope. There, against boxes of sporting goods and salad tubs, lay a certificate clipped into a cardboard frame. Bachelor of Science, Occupational Therapy, State University, the paper declared, official in a way the janitor's uniform had not been. She almost laughed, and then the sound was too close to a sob. Of course he had training. That explained the exercises, the language, the way he corrected the angle of Julian's foot with the ease of someone who had learned to read bodies for a living. But how had a man with an occupational therapy degree become a night janitor and volunteer therapist? The question lodged in her like an accusation. If he had been turned down by hospitals, if he had been relegated by circumstance or by prejudice to the margins, it would not matter to a contract or a ledger. It would matter to a child.
Sabrina could see the contours of his life. An education followed by an absence of opportunity. A marriage that began with bright hopes and ended in grief. A daughter who needed him. A community that needed someone to stay. She found a photo tucked behind the diploma. Elliot with a woman whose smile filled the frame. A child asleep in the crook of her arm. The name Elena appeared in ink on the back, a small italic script. Sabrina felt, with a curiously maternal precision, the dimensions of the man before her. He was present in the spaces that the world had deemed expendable. He was practicing a kind of care that did not fit neatly into budgets or business plans. She watched him the way a strategist watches a long game, mapping touch to progress, noting the ritual of arrival, the homemade tools. When he wasn't on his knees, he was in the back of the center, teaching other parents how to replicate an exercise, or how to adapt a household object into a therapeutic aid. He kept lists of community members who had referred children to him. He recorded measurements, degrees of flexion, improvements in grip, and dated them in a methodical hand. Each halting success was a small ledge climbed, documented, and celebrated. Sabrina's life, on the other hand, was measured by different instruments: board votes, shareholder letters, the exact moment an investor might be convinced to double down. There had been a time, a decade earlier, when the difference between a morning at St. Mary and a morning at a management summit might not have felt so vast. But she had learned to trade small personal rituals for public victories. Her love had become a private liability, intense in passion, but transactional in practice. Julian's health had allowed her to be that kind of mother, attentive enough on paper, disengaged in the messy reality of caregiving. And yet, here was a man who did not own a company, who may have been underemployed, who nonetheless had the patience to do the work that money could not replicate. He did not have a title that granted him authority. He had, instead, a history that had taught him how to return. There were nights when Sabrina slipped into the study after dinner and watched the footage, not because she wanted to claim credit for her son's care, but because she could not let go of Elliot's hands. Those hands told stories the polished fingers of consultants and specialists did not. They had scraped soap from dishes and mended torn sleeves. They had steadied a child who had been learning to stand. They were hands that had learned to make do. And, in doing so, they had learned to teach bodies to try again. Her watching became a study in contrasts. In boardrooms, she had learned to admire decisiveness, moves that solved problems quickly and cleanly. Yet Elliot's work required a different kind of intelligence, the intelligence of repetition, of humility, of learning through failure. He tried things, failed, adjusted, tried again. He celebrated the small increments other people overlooked. It was not only competence that surprised her. It was the way he spoke to parents, never condescending, always instructive, with a vocabulary stripped of technical arrogance and rich in invitation. "Let's try lifting his foot this way," he told a mother at St. Mary, "and then count to 3 together." The simplicity of the instruction invited partnership rather than dependence. The choice of words created a team where the system had taught people to be clients. Sabrina began to follow him outside the cameras.
She waited in her car in the lot at St. Mary, watching him rise from the bench where he had sat with Nora and cross the street with a backpack slung over one shoulder. She followed him to the train station, where he bought a ticket with exact change, and later to a diner where he ate at the counter and doodled exercises on a napkin. She would see him stand in line to pick up a coloring book for Nora, the corners frayed, the ink smudged. These were small, domestic moments that expanded the man into a life. There were things about his life that did not fit the neat categories she held. He kept receipts folded into his wallet for therapy supplies. The handwriting on those receipts matched the handwriting in his notebook. He had a volunteer badge from St. Mary, and he had, impossibly, a binder containing letters from parents, thank you notes, and short testimonies about things he had helped their children accomplish. Nothing in the binder was flashy, but the binder had weight. What unsettled Sabrina most, and what eventually drove her deeper than observation, was how Julian changed in Elliot's presence. It was not merely that Julian laughed, though that alone would have been enough to pierce Sabrina's usual defenses. It was the way Julian leaned toward him, how his chest lifted, how he seemed to discover that his body could do small things that mattered. The progress was incremental and fragile, but it was real in a way metrics on a chart had failed to be. At the end of one long week of watching and following, of phone calls to assistants and quiet research into the local universities, Sabrina sat at her dining table with a stack of printouts. Elliot's name appeared on a program sheet. A small local article mentioned a night clinic where volunteers worked with families who could not afford traditional therapy. The article quoted him, "You don't have to be rich to teach someone how to reach." The line lifted off the page in a way that felt accusatory and liberating at once. She also found a blurred photograph of a woman on that same article, Elena, Elliot's wife, smiling into the camera as if it's some private joke. The caption noted she had been a therapist who had died 2 years earlier. The obituary spoke of a brave young woman whose research on adaptive play had quietly circulated through community centers. Sabrina read the paragraphs twice. In them, she saw a partial explanation. A man trained not only by coursework, but by grief and commitment. Elena, it seemed, had taught Elliot how to see care as vocation. The discoveries accumulated and rearranged the interior geometry of Sabrina's world. She had always believed that money could optimize outcomes, that the best answer to any problem was the one with the clearest bottom line. She had not yet built the vocabulary to understand a different kind of accounting, the slow accrual of trust, the dividends paid in confidence and small, repeatable victories. On a gray afternoon when the sky matched the tone of her mood, Sabrina found herself outside the doors of St. Mary with no grand plan. The center smelled of baking bread and the faint antiseptic of a place used for more than one purpose. Inside, children were clustered over an activity table while Elliot worked with a boy whose posture in a walker had improved since the last time she had peered through her camera. The boy reached, hands shaking, for a bead on a string. Elliot stabilized the movement with a steadying word and an adjusted hand, then stepped back. The kid snapped the bead into place and threw his head back with a laugh that would have been at home in Sabrina's own living room. Sabrina watched. The sight of her son's laughter in this room ached across a distance she had cultivated with intent. She felt the old instincts to protect and to control rise like a reflex. But control, she saw now, would have required her to seize the process for herself, to displace the one quietly doing the work. Instead, she felt an unfamiliar impulse, to support, to provide resources so that this small, effective work could continue. The reality of Elliot's life complicated the impulse. He played the part of the humble volunteer well, but in the binder she had seen the diploma and the binder of testimonials. He had qualifications that placed him within professional circles, but something had pushed him out of those circles and into the margins where he improvised and served. It was not generosity alone that compelled his presence at St. Mary. It was a refusal to let circumstances dictate the terms of care. Sabrina left the center that day feeling like a woman with a new kind of problem. She was the richest person in a city that had a father with a degree teaching what money had not replaced, and she had to decide whether to act. The decision would not be about philanthropy in the abstract. It would be about recognition, about changing the life of a child who loved to laugh, and about whether she could let go of the tidy metrics that had defined her effectiveness. The question settled into her like a stone at the base of her throat. It was not only a question of funding or contracts. It was a question about how to see, whether to let the janitor remain a nameless hand in the periphery, or to acknowledge, publicly and privately, the dignity of his work.
That night, she lay awake, imagining conversations she had not had and apologies she would owe herself. She imagined Julian, years from now, remembering the man who taught him that his body could answer back if someone would simply stay with him long enough to find its language. She saw Elliot's hands again and again, and the image of them became a mirror held up to a life in which she had learned to value power over presence. In the quiet between one breath and the next, she made a decision she could not name. She did not know what it would cost her, emotionally, reputationally, or financially. But she recognized that some things, once seen, could not unseen. The sight of those hands in her son's room had changed the axis of her thinking. What this billionaire had seen from the single-dad janitor had already begun to leave her speechless. She waited then for the next beat, for the moment when the rest of the story would make itself known. She had gathered evidence, a diploma in a garage, a binder of parents' letters, a set of hand-drawn adaptations, and the recorded laughter of her son. But knowing was only the first step. What mattered now was choice, how she would translate her witnessing into action without stripping the dignity of the person she had come to admire. On a late morning the following week, she followed Elliot to a park in Burbank. Nora was there, running with a stick that doubled as a sword. Elliot sat on a bench checking the strap of a brace he had adjusted the night before. He did not notice her at first. When he did, he gave her that small, measured nod that strangers offer when they meet a face that has watched them for a while. "Miss Lennox," he said, as if the title mattered more to form than to substance. His voice carried the fatigue of long days and the steadiness of someone who had to be present for small miracles every night. "Sabrina," she answered, dropping the formality as if by agreement. They sat, awkwardness braided with an undertone of necessity. She had rehearsed lines about contracts and offers in the car, but those rehearsed sentences evaporated like breath on glass. Instead, she asked about Nora, about St. Mary, about Elena. He answered in short sentences, sometimes looking away as if some facts were easier to tell in pieces. "My wife taught me a lot," he said, with the careful reverence people reserve for the deceased. "She believed kids should be seen as builders, not as problems. After Elena died, I kept doing what she taught me, because Nora needed me, and because the families at St. Mary needed someone who would keep showing up." The park smelled of wet leaves. Children called across the field. For the first time since witnessing him in her son's room, Sabrina saw Elliot fully. No longer just the figure kneeling in her hallway, but a whole person with grief and love braided together. She noticed how he watched his daughter, how his shoulders unknotted when she laughed. She realized he had built a life on the labor of love and the discipline of skill. As they spoke, Sabrina felt the outlines of a proposal forming without her command. She thought of contracts and official titles and of a way to integrate a skill set he had been forced to improvise back into formal, licensed practice. She thought of all the resources she controlled that could propagate the quiet work he did across neighborhoods that had been invisible to her philanthropy. But the path from seeing to offering was not a straight one. It would demand humility, her own, and require that she move beyond a savior instinct that had sometimes defined her giving.
She needed to understand the boundaries, licensing, documentation, the ethical pitfalls of employing someone whose path into practice had been irregular. She would need to listen, to make space, and to reckon with how the institutions she oversaw often erased the value of invisible labor. Elliot, for his part, did not beg. He spoke about practices and about families, about a boy who had learned to pick up a toy because someone slowed down to make the motion repeatable. He mentioned Elena again, briefly, and then changed the subject as if the wound was raw. He spoke of St. Mary as if it were a fragile thing, a place kept afloat by a community that refused to let it sink. Sabrina realized she was not offering charity in that moment. She was standing on a threshold between two kinds of power, the power to command resources and the power to give recognition. They were not the same. When she left the park, she felt something like obligation and something like grace. She had seen something that shifted the coordinates of her life. The problem was that seeing alone was not enough. The larger question loomed. How would she move from private watching to something that altered the life of a single dad, a foundation, and a son who had begun to laugh again? She found herself rehearsing again, not for meetings this time, but for a conversation in which she would offer support without erasing the agency of the man who had captured her attention. She was, for the first time in years, both frightened and exhilarated at the possibility that what she chose next could matter in a way that quarterly earnings never had. In the days that followed, she began to test the edges of a plan. She drafted an offer in the privacy of her office, carefully phrased, legally vetted, and generous enough to build a program. She ran possibilities by counsel and by her chief of staff, always mindful of the ethical lines she had been trained to respect. She thought of creating a formal role for Elliot at St. Mary, with clinical supervision and a pathway back into licensed practice if needed. She imagined funding a renovation for the center that would make room for families like Julian's and for people like Elliot who were already doing the work on the margins. But even as she drew up legal frameworks, she felt the old, familiar tension between the impulse to act and the fear of doing more harm than good. The world had a way of turning gestures into headlines and headlines into simplifications. She feared the reduction of a man's life to a quote in a press release. For now, she kept to watching and to planning in private, letting the image of Elliot kneeling in Julian's room and Nora dancing in the park remain the engine of her resolve. Each replay of that image hardened her decision. If she had seen something that changed the axis of her thinking, she would not let it remain an observation. She would give it form. And yet there was one more thing she needed to know, one last piece of the puzzle she could not justify conjecturing about. It sat like a question mark between her and any action. Why had a qualified therapist become a janitor? Why had Elena's legacy not carried him into institutions that might have recognized his training sooner? The answers would require conversations that felt risky and personal. Sabrina squared her shoulders and scheduled one of those conversations for the coming week. She told herself it would be a simple, practical meeting, an offer, parameters, an integration plan. But inside, she felt the tremor of anticipation that comes with uncharted moral choice. She had seen something that left vacancies in the ledger of her life. It was time to fill them. As she drove back toward the mansion that evening, the city lights flaring against the glass, she let the thoughts settle. What this billionaire had seen from the single-dad janitor would require her to change. She did not yet know how, but in the quiet that followed, she held the image of Julian's laughter like a fragile proof that perception could bend outcomes. The rest, she knew, would demand more than observation. It would demand courage. She did not wait long. The meeting she had rehearsed became real in the clean sterility of a conference room she rarely used for anything not tied to a quarterly report. Elliot walked in like any other man out of a life that did not belong to polished surfaces. Shoulders slightly hunched from days on his feet, palms that had the quiet map of someone who fixed things by hand. He sat across from her without ceremony, and for a moment the two of them regarded one another as if they were measuring a distance that had nothing to do with square footage. I wanted to talk about something practical, Sabrina started, because it was the form she still knew best. A formal role at St. Mary, supported hours, funding for the center, a position that acknowledges your work. Elliot's face did not change, as if that calm was a shield. He folded his hands. "Ms. Lennox," he said. Then, reading the room, he softened. "Sabrina, I appreciate it. I've never wanted headlines. I just want to do the work I was trained to do and make sure my daughter has what she needs."
She pushed the offer gently across the cable. An outline of salary, a position title prepared with counsel, a budget for supplies and renovations. Elliot read the pages with an even breath. When he reached the paragraph that mentioned clinical supervision and credentialing, his eyes lifted and something like a small, exhausted relief passed over him. "That's fair," he said. "There's one problem, though. After Elena died, I couldn't complete the supervised hours the state requires. I kept caring for Nora. Licensure requires time I didn't have. Hospitals wanted a continuous record. I don't have that. So I'd need supervised hours to be back in full practice." Sabrina leaned in. She had expected resistance to money. She had not expected paperwork to be an emotional wedge. It was jarring to watch a man who could map muscle function into exercises be held back by bureaucracy in a way she, who had built companies, could easily fix. The fix, however, would need more than checks. It would need a change to a system that often regarded uneven lives as disqualifying. "Then we'll create the supervision," she said before she could stop herself. "We have relationships with the hospital. We can formalize a pathway: supervision, documentation, continuing education. If you want to do it properly, we'll make it possible." Elliot did not accept immediately. He asked questions about autonomy and about how the work would be presented to families. He worried about losing the informality that allowed parents to trust him. He was protective, too, of Elena's memory, of the way she taught him to listen before he spoke to a child. When he finally nodded, the gesture was small but decisive. It was the first concession to partnership. It was also a negotiation over dignity. The contract was drafted with cautious optimism. A paid fellowship, supervised clinical hours provided by the medical staff at St. Mary and the Lennox Foundation, and a budget for renovating a small wing into a therapy suite. Dr. Patricia Morgan, a rehabilitation specialist who had read about St. Mary's Nights and whose curiosity had been piqued by Sabrina's calls, agreed to oversee Elliot's re-entry into formal practice. Emily Ross, a case manager known for translating hospital procedure into human terms, volunteered to coordinate the paperwork. Even as plans folded into place, something impatient and human propelled Elliot to work with Julian with a new intensity. This was not driven by money. It was the pressure of windows. Limited time to demonstrate the value of a relational approach to skeptics, to show families they could make progress without losing personal agency. The exercises became more deliberate. Repetitions multiplied. Julian, who had been responding in small increments to the ritual of touch and instruction, began to engage in sessions that were more complex, more demanding, and, in their way, more hopeful. One afternoon, a month into the agreement, hope tipped close to danger. Elliot and Julian were alone in the house. Sabrina had schedules that kept her at the office until late. The session had been adapted by the team at St. Mary: a tighter set of guided lifts, a new brace to support Julian's knee, a carefully timed sequence intended to advance strength without overtaxing. Elliot monitored Julian's face for every cue. He counted out loud and encouraged. Julian reached for a toy across the bed, and his leg extended as if to answer a question he had been taught to ask. Then there was a sharp, surprised cry. Less sound than a break in rhythm. Julian clutched at his leg. Elliot's hands were immediately on him, gentle and precise, but the boy's face had shifted into a pain that made Elliot's stomach knot. He set Julian down, assessed the limb, and found a tightness that suggested a significant muscle strain rather than a fracture. He called for Sabrina, and in the moments before the ambulance arrived, he tried to soothe. He felt the cold press of fear. Professional fear of causing harm by pushing, and the acute, personal fear of failing a child he had come to love.
At the hospital, the bright efficiency of emergency medicine swallowed small human chaos. Nurses moved with practiced kindness. Tests ruled out breakage. The diagnosis, severe muscle strain, was chilling enough. Dr. Richard Preston, a neurologist who had been on staff for years and who had become one of Julian's regular consultants, received them with the calm of someone who had seen many such crises. He treated the strain and ordered rest, imaging, and a careful follow-up, but the administrative aftershock was as significant as the medical work. Within 48 hours, legal counsel from the hospital had requested a meeting with Sabrina. They were careful with language: unauthorized therapeutic intervention, risk exposure, potential liability. Their questions were procedural rather than malicious. Did Elliot have current registration? Were sessions supervised? The hospital had protocols to protect patients and staff. They were explicit that an unsanctioned, at-home session could be grounds for serious review. Their concern, both ethical and legal, was reasonable. Their tone, however, in that moment felt to Sabrina like a judgment carved from distance. When she returned home that evening, she found Elliot waiting on the steps as if he expected either a reprieve or exile. He looked smaller than she had seen him before, careworn in a way that seeped under the skin. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I pushed. I thought I could feel where the line was and I misjudged. Sabrina stopped him before his apology could become a confession. She felt something jagged and immediate, anger at the system, at the situation, at herself for having set things in motion that may have placed Julian at risk. She also felt something else, a fierce, protective surge for the man who had been doing the work she could not. Her reaction was messy. Corporate caution collided with maternal panic. "We're going to have to pause," she said, voice tight, "until the hospital is satisfied, until there is a clear, accountable plan." Elliot's chin dropped. The pause felt like exile. "Miss Lennox," he said, "I violated protocols." "You violated a rule," she corrected, the word jagged, "not a crime. But the hospital will see it as a risk." He left with his backpack slung over his shoulder, his gait an honest accounting of defeat. Sabrina watched him go, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the suffocating weight of responsibility in a way that had no spreadsheet to organize it. She had witnessed something that moved her. Her actions had put that movement at risk. The weeks that followed were a study in bureaucratic friction and personal erosion. The hospital convened a review board. Dr. Preston, precise and reserved, expressed both clinical curiosity and concern. "We have observed measurable improvements under unconventional care," he said at one meeting, sliding pages across the conference table. Objective measures, dynamometry, functional reach tests, showed gains in muscle activation and coordination during the period Elliot was working with Julian. On several measures, we recorded improvements in the range of 20 to 35% compared to baseline. He was careful to frame the numbers as data, not miracles. "These are significant," he added, "but they do not negate the fact that unregulated interventions carry risk. Our duty is to protect patients and to integrate effective methods into supervised, evidence-based practice." Legal counsel worried about precedent. Nursing leadership worried about liability. The review board recommended a temporary restriction on unsupervised home sessions until a formal integration plan, with supervision and documentation, was in place. They did not accuse Elliot of malice. Their language remained procedural. Still, the outcome was clear. Elliot could not return to Julian's home unsupervised. Sabrina complied. She issued a calm email articulating the hospital's position and asking for cooperation. The message was clean and responsible on paper. In the house, it felt like a lock sliding home on a door she had just opened. In the absence of Elliot, Julian did something that prickled through Sabrina's chest like an ache. The boy, who had been gathering confidence in the rhythm of presence and repetition, shrank back. Where he had faced tasks before with cautious joy, he began to withdraw. preferring the safety of seated play to the tentative movement they had labored to build. He stopped laughing in that candid, bellied way. He spoke less to the toys that had once animated him. The physical regression was subtle at first, less range of motion, a bit less endurance, but the emotional loss was profound. Sabrina found herself beside his bed at night, listening for sounds she couldn't manufacture.
There was one night when Julian woke, eyes wide in the darkness, and called out for Elliot by name. "Papa," he said, in a voice that blurred the edges between located family and chosen family. Sabrina stood by the doorway and felt something inside her rearrange. She had watched, she had stepped in, she had removed the person who had given her son something he had not had in months. The moral calculus tightened. Sabrina did not act purely out of guilt. She consulted Dr. Preston again, this time inside the sterile privacy of his office, where the walls were lined with the quiet evidence of a life spent in medicine. She asked him to review Julian's decline and to consider whether an integrated approach, one that combined formal oversight with Elliot's relational competence, was possible. He listened like a man who had seen many forms of hope and many kinds of institutional resistance. "What you describe is meaningful," he said, "but it must be formalized. If there's data showing improvement correlated with how Elliot works, we should examine it scientifically. However, that must be within a supervised program. We have to protect the child and the practitioners." They agreed to conduct a systematic reevaluation, baseline functional tests, muscle activation studies where applicable, and a multidisciplinary meeting to design a path forward. The reevaluation took a week. Sabrina sat through assessments with the replaced armor of corporate composure. Beneath it, her palms sweated and her throat tightened. When Dr. Preston presented the findings, he did so with the measured cadence of someone giving both good news and caution. Julian's functional tests indicate a measurable improvement over the last 3 months, strength gains in targeted muscle groups, better endurance for short assisted tasks, and improved coordination, he said. "On standardized measures our team uses, we've documented changes, on the order of 20 to 30% in certain modalities, during the period Elliot was actively working with him." Sabrina felt the numbers like a weather pattern. The data confirmed what her eyes had known, but they also underscored how fragile progress could be. Dr. Preston continued, "The issue we must address is this. The improvements correlate with his involvement, but the delivery was not in a supervised framework. We can replicate the benefits, but only if we integrate the approach into a clinical model that has oversight, documentation, and clear safety protocols." That sentence became Sabrina's call to action. It reframed her guilt into an operational requirement. If the hospital would not tolerate unsanctioned practice, then she would work to build the sanctioned framework that could hold the practice. To do so would mean accepting accountability and inviting the scrutiny she had feared. It would mean dismantling old habits, of giving money as an answer, and assuming institutions would adopt whatever she funded without changing the systems that governed them. Sabrina moved with the deliberateness of a bored strategist who had decided to change the rules of engagement. She convened the necessary meetings. She insisted that Elliot be given an opportunity to re-enter under supervision, not as a standoffish charity case, but as part of a funded pilot working with the hospital and St. Mary. Emily Ross became the bridge, translating bureaucracy into practice. Dr. Patricia Morgan agreed to be clinical lead. Mrs. Rodriguez, who ran day-to-day programming at St. Mary, took on the task of coordinating schedules and community outreach. Elliot, initially hesitant, accepted the plan with a humility that was almost formal. He agreed to documentation and to the oversight he had once been denied. He also insisted on protections for the families he served. Informed consent forms that would explain the nature of community-based therapy, flexible scheduling to maintain trust, and a commitment that community voices would shape the program's design. The integration model that emerged was deliberate and cautious. Elliot would be hired as a clinical associate within a pilot program, paid, supervised, and accountable to Dr. Morgan and the hospital's rehabilitation team.
He would accrue the supervised clinical hours necessary for full licensure. St. Mary would receive renovation funding to create a therapy suite with accessible equipment. The Lennox Foundation would underwrite a training program for parents, practical workshops that would teach families how to support daily exercises safely. Importantly, the program would seek to maintain the informality that made Elliot's work effective, his ability to translate technical exercises into language parents could use, and his insistence that therapy be a partnership rather than a prescription. When the announcement was made public, carefully worded to respect privacy and to celebrate a partnership of support rather than a single savior story, there was a muted, earnest energy in the St. Mary lobby. People came with curiosity and with guarded hope. Sabrina stood near the back, watching Elliot move among families like a man who belonged. He introduced her to parents with a modest, practical warmth that made introductions feel like acts of inclusion rather than spectacle. The renovation took weeks, with contractors who painted in warmer tones and volunteers who turned donated furniture into accessible therapy stations. A plaque was placed by the door, "Elena Hayes' Room," in memory of the woman who taught us to see what children can build. Elliot touched the plaque one evening with a hand that trembled slightly, as if he could carry Elena's impact into the work each day. Sabrina did more than sign checks. She rewired schedules. The first week into the pilot, she left the office at 5 on the dot. Her assistant almost had a panic attack. Board members messaged with thinly veiled contempt. Investors frowned. Sabrina endured their impatience with a steadiness that surprised even her. She learned to like the way the city looked from the side streets in the late afternoon, the way the light softened across anonymous brick, and the way laughter in a modest room could have the density of something precious. At the center, the team worked with a new rhythm. Dr. Morgan held case conferences where clinical evidence met lived experience. Nurses taught safe handling. Emily compiled family histories and turned anecdotes into patterns. Elliot came each evening with a backpack of carefully curated tools, wedges, carved splints, a small binder with Elena's notes. And the children who had once learned with him now came expecting to try. Parents were trained not only to do exercises, but to speak the encouragement that translated small labor into confidence. Julian's first supervised session back with Elliot happened under the careful gaze of Dr. Morgan and with Emily documenting progress. The boy approached the task with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. Elliot spoke in the familiar cadence he had used from the start, simple, direct phrases that felt more like promises than instructions. 3 breaths, then reach, he said quietly, and Julian obeyed, the motion a small bright thing. Progress under supervision was still painstaking. There were setbacks and moments of doubt, but the administration of care had shifted. Risk was managed through documentation and shared decision-making. Progress was measured with validated tools and celebrated in the small, human ways that made the numbers matter. Word spread quietly, then with greater force. Parents began to talk about games that encouraged movement, about adapting household items into therapy tools. Mrs. Rodriguez started a Saturday class where families could come for peer support. Nora, Elliot's daughter, began to attend with him and, slowly, grew more confident in spaces that had once felt precarious. She took part in group activities, sometimes hiding behind a hand, sometimes announcing a preference for a particular puzzle piece with the uncompromising sincerity only a child has. The presence of other children, of adults who saw the dignity in small work, allowed her to emerge in ways that statistics could not fully capture. Sabrina found herself in surprised places, watching Nora paint during a volunteer night, sharing coffee with mothers who smelled like the city and who had names that stayed with her in ways boardroom titles never had. She learned to accept gratitude without letting it become a currency she controlled. Her role evolved from donor to partner. With each handshake and each listening ear, the walls that had separated her life from the lives she sought to impact thinned. The big moment, one the press would later compress into a single frame if given the chance, came at the center on a damp spring morning when the therapy suite seemed full of winter light and breath held in teeth. Julian had been practicing a supported standing sequence for months. Each attempt had been documented and measured. The team had scaled the assistance carefully, from a full-body harness and 2 therapists to a single support strap held by an adult and 1 guiding hand. Sabrina had been certified in the basic home exercises and had practiced them under supervision for weeks. She had blundered through awkward repetitions at home, as mothers and fathers often do, trying to learn a language of touch and timing she had never known before. Today, she stood in the room in an ordinary sweater, holding one of Julian's hands. Elliot stood across from them, his voice low and steady. Dr. Preston stood to the side with a small device for measurement, clinically observing but emotionally present. Emily documented the session. The whole team watched without crowding. Julian looked between the faces he trusted. Elliot, with his unglamorous hands that had taught him motion. Sabrina, with a new kind of presence that had moved from paper pledges to embodied formation. And Dr. Preston, whose cautious endorsement had helped create the scaffolding. "One breath," Elliot said, "then step." Julian planted his foot. Sabrina felt the tiny tremor of muscle and tendon as a child stretches something into being. The first step was small, a half lean, an inch across the linoleum that registered on Dr. Preston's device as a minute gain in stride length. It was followed by a pause, in which no one spoke. Then, gathering courage from the pause, Julian took a second small step. His face opened like a threshold. For those seconds, the room was not clinical, but sacred. When Julian made the third deliberate step and then sank into his chair with a proud breath that created a laugh half born of exhaustion and half of glee, the room let itself exhale. It was not a cure. No one used that word. There were still limits and ongoing work. But there was movement, actual, measurable, human movement, arrived at through the intersection of science and sustained, loving repetition. Sabrina's hands were still warm from grasping his. She felt the absurd, simple thrill that comes when you have helped something happen. Elliot's eyes met hers, and there was no need for a press release smile. There was gratitude, shared and quiet. Dr. Preston made a clinical note in his file about improved functional mobility that, in his words, aligned with both the documented interventions and the relational consistency Elliot brought to the sessions. The pilot program continued, and the center became a place of small daily labors rather than a sudden miracle. Elliot accrued supervised hours and moved closer to full licensure. The Lennox Foundation funded a community training fund, and the Elena Hayes Room became, over time, a hub not only for therapy, but for education, parent workshops, volunteer training, and a seed program to help other therapists who had fallen into gaps of employment re-enter clinical practice. Sabrina's life changed in ways that were readable on paper. She began to arrive at family dinners earlier, to scale back a number of board commitments, to insist on no meetings after 6 on certain nights. Those were visible shifts. The deeper change was less legible. In the manner she listened when a parent at St. Mary spoke of a small triumph, in the way she stopped offering solutions and began asking questions, in the way she learned to sit with ambiguity rather than fill it with action. There were hard conversations along the way. Some people on the board felt she had erred in bringing such a personal program into a foundation's portfolio. Others worried about precedent. Sabrina accepted critiques with a humility that had cost her practice. She acknowledged publicly that she had made mistakes, most visibly when she had failed to recognize how institutional barriers had kept Elliot out of practice. She used those moments to advocate for policy changes at the hospital level, clearer pathways for practitioners who had interrupted their official training for caregiving responsibilities, and supervised reentry programs funded by philanthropy with safeguards against liability. The center's reach widened. Maria, who had once been a client at St. Mary, became a trained paraprofessional. David, a volunteer who had been an assistant coach in a nearby park, piloted recreational modules that turned therapy into play. Mrs. Rodriguez ran family nights where people ate, traded tips, and found the ordinary grace of solidarity. The work Elliot had done in the margins began to ripple outward into a modest infrastructure that made room for people whose lives had not fit neatly into institutional expectations. Nora, who had always been a quiet sun in Elliot's orbit, grew bolder. She took a place in group art sessions and began to respond to social cues more readily. One evening, she brought a small painted card to Julian and handed it to him with a solemn face that betrayed enormous pride. Sabrina watched Nora hand over the card and felt something like a stitch undo in her chest. It was an image she had not known she needed to hold, that the people who heal are often those who have themselves been held together by love. In the slow months that followed, the new family configuration found rhythms. Sabrina and Elliot developed a practical intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with mutual respect and shared responsibility. They watched Julian together, coordinating schedules with the careful choreography of people who had learned to move around a child's needs. They invited Nora to the Lennox house for a backyard barbecue where scrubbed laughter blended with the smell of burgers and whispered conversations about school supplies and homework. Sabrina learned to braid Nora's hair badly but earnestly. Nora giggled at the lopsidedness and decided she liked it nonetheless. There were moments of old life that surfaced like intrusions. A deal would threaten to pull Sabrina into a week of travel. She negotiated and, more often than she once would have, let go. A shareholder opined. She accepted the pushback. These sacrifices were not dramatic displays, but the everyday trimming of priorities that made care possible. Months later, at a modest ceremony to formally open the renovated wing, Sabrina gave a speech that surprised more than a few guests by its lack of corporate cadence. She spoke as a mother and as someone who had been compelled to watch. "Seeing is not the same as responsibility," she said, voice steady. "Seeing must become a commitment. I thought I had been doing what mattered, but what I learned is that presence, consistent, humble presence, matters in ways money alone cannot ensure. We built these rooms so others might have what my son found in a man who came from a life very different from mine." Elliot stood at her side as she spoke, and when she finished, he stepped forward to say a few words that were spare and luminous. He spoke of Elena, of Nora, of the families who had trusted him. He spoke of mistakes he had made and of the work of repairing them. He did not seek heroism, he sought partnership. The applause that followed felt genuine and informative, less a coronation than an acknowledgement. As the program matured, Sabrina continued to hold the role she had chosen. She did not efface herself into philanthropy's most dramatic scenes. She insisted the center keep community leadership central. She insisted on transparency and evaluation. She also allowed her presence at home to be messy and real. On many nights, she would be found sitting on Julian's floor, practicing the very exercises she had once outsourced. She would count aloud with him in voices that felt oddly young and deeply present. Julian began to call her mama with a softness that had returned to the word through his regained trust. There was no miraculous epilogue in which every limitation evaporated. Duchenne remained Duchenne. There were days of fatigue and frustration and limits that were obvious and immutable. But within constraint lay room for astonishment. There were measurable gains, and there were gains that no machine could register. Confidence in a child's eyes, a parent's renewed capacity to keep showing up, a community that could hold the work of care instead of relegating it to margins. Sabrina's transformation was not instantaneous. It was the accumulation of small acts and the steady willingness to be vulnerable, both to being wrong and to being seen as someone who could change. In quiet moments, she still measured outcomes. Her training did not dissolve overnight, but she had added a new metric, dignity. She learned to value processes that honored agency, and she learned that recognition could be a form of reparation. The St. Mary program went on to train other paraprofessionals and to pilot a scholarship fund for older students returning to occupational therapy who had interrupted their schooling for caregiving. Elliot, over time, secured the supervised hours he needed. He reactivated his license and became a model for re-entry programs. He never lost the humility that had characterized his early nights at the center. If anything, his new title made him more careful with words and more generous with guidance. In the years that followed, Sabrina would sometimes return to the image that had started it all, the man on his knees at the foot of a bed, hands cupping a small child's leg with the intimacy of someone who had decided to stay. She would remember the first laugh she had heard in months and the way it had unsettled a life built on scheduled success. She would remember the contractual hesitations, the hospital meetings, the small betrayals, and the corrections that followed. She would remember the way a clinical board had shifted because adults chose to bridge the brittle line between systems and people. In the end, what she had seen did more than make her speechless for a moment. It made her listen. It made her choose accountability over performative action, partnership over patronage. It taught her that wealth could be used to design systems that protect and honor those who do the quiet work of care, and that respect looks like supervision, like pathways back into practice, like funding that trusts rather than erases. On a late afternoon, years after the first laugh, Sabrina sat at a small table at St. Mary with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm. Elliot's daughter Nora slid into the chair across from her and pushed over a stack of colored cards she had made. Julian, now older and steadier on his feet, wandered in with his parents, his stride not perfect but steady. He waved at Sabrina with a small, easy smile that carried the weight of many tiny victories. Sabrina watched them and felt a kind of gratitude that was not showy. It was quiet and long-term, the kind that settles into decisions rather than headlines. She had been changed by seeing someone choose to show up. The change had required her to step out of the high visibility of philanthropic gestures and into the low, steady work of partnership. It had cost time and reputation and the easy rhythm of her old life, but it had given, in return, a different rhythm in which presence mattered in the ledger of her life. What this billionaire saw from the single-dad janitor, she thought, an echo of the sentence that had drifted through her mind from the start, was not only skill. It was devotion made practical. It was the insistence on showing up.
She smiled. Not the corporate smile she sometimes practiced in mirrors, but the real one that creased the corners of her eyes. It was a face that had learned to measure value in a new currency. If you were moved by this story, share it with someone who needs to remember that dignity often lives in how we treat those whose titles don't appear on business cards. If this tale gives you hope, subscribe for more stories where seeing leads to change and where small acts of presence rebuild the contours of community.